Boola boola, everyone. Today I'm going to be going through the cognitive approach when the stupid slide starts to pull his finger out. There we go. Um, so the cognitive approach today. One of the more complex ones, just because it's not really an extremist argument. But let's jump straight in, right? So, what does the cognitive approach say is the cause of most, if not all, human behavior? Essentially, the way you think, right? So, that's what it basically comes down to. That's what the cognitive approach is about, is the way you process information. And by process, we mean how you think, how you mull over something, how you basically process it, right? So at the core of the cognitive approach is what you see on the screen, the informational processing model, also known as the computational model. What I will say about this video, by the way, is what I have in the slides is slightly different to what's in the workbook. So I am just going to briefly go through the workbook at the end of this just to make sure there's nothing I've really missed out. But the information processing model is this, right? It says that the mind works like a computer, and we basically take information from our senses, and you're doing that from your five senses right now, or the five senses we know about at least. You're taking information from your five senses, and you are processing it, thinking about it in very different ways, and therefore it's that different processing that leads to different output. For example, all of you right now are watching the exact same video. Fair enough, you're doing it in different rooms, or you're probably doing it in different rooms. You're doing different lighting, maybe you're in different moods kind of thing, but you're all watching the same video, and that is the input, right? So you're all getting a standardized environmental stimuli. Now, the way you're processing what I'm saying is going to be very, very different. So, for example, some of you have got varied levels of attention. That's going to affect it. Some of you might be in a bad mood, for example. That's going to affect it. So, essentially, the way someone just walked by. The way you process information has a direct impact on the output, which is known as the behavior. So the example I use with all my students, and I apologize if you heard this 100 times, but I want to imagine you walking down the road, and someone very, very attractive walks past you and kind of looks you up and down, right? Just like just a little look up and down. I've given you the same input. A lot of you are going to process this in very, very different ways. So, for example, some of you may feel self-conscious. Why are they looking at me? Why is this really attractive person looking at me? They don't deserve to look at me. And maybe you might feel shame or irritated, for example. If you're like me and you have a massive head, you may process that of, they're checking me out. Oh, they're clearly, because I'm very nice to look at. Clearly they're checking me out, and that's going to give these people a confidence boost. So in the same situation, we process things very differently, and that leads to very different behaviors. A absolutely crucial thing to write down here is the cognitive approach is brilliant at explaining individual differences, why we put all humans into the same environment, the same situation, and yet the behavior is really, really different. The cognitive approach is a fantastic explanation for this. So I want to go into this in a bit more detail. Apologies, these slides I need to update. I have updated them recently. I just haven't done a good job. So let's just say you see someone crying. Let's say you're walking down the street at 10 p.m. all alone. You're not with anybody, and there is let's say a female crying, sitting down on a brick wall on the side of the pavement you're walking on. Right? I only say this specifically because this happened to me X number of years ago. Right, input. You're going to process this. What sort of things go through your mind? Right? Where does this? What are you going to do? How are you interpreting that input? So for me, when I was 16 years old, at the time I was with a very, very how do I put this? Emotional partner who would cry a lot and would I'd get in trouble for a lot of things, and basically my schema at that time, and I'll come on to schemas in a second, my schema at that time was, if somebody's crying, get out of the situation, basically. Now that would have had an impact on my behavior. The way we think, the way we process, what our schemas are, have a direct influence on our behavior. And in this case, when I was 16 years old, I calmly, and I'm not very proud of this, by the way, I calmly crossed the road and just walked on because I thought crime female is trouble, etc., etc. That was my schema, obviously very wrong. And I crossed the road. Now, I wouldn't do that now, right? Which kind of suggests that maybe schemas change. And for some reason, there's polar bears hugging here. I really do need to address these slides. But if you have autism, and one way of approaching autism is simply that people with autism process things in just a different way, in just not a worse way, not a better way, in just a different way. And that is why if you process things very differently, then your behavior is going to be very different as well. I should also put that, obviously people with autism have different inputs as well. They're very sensory people with autism a lot of the time. And that also affects it as well. So schemas. Now, I've mentioned this word a couple of times, right? Schemas, how do I put this? They influence your processing. That's, again, a good thing to note down. They're mental representations of what we know. So they're basically, I always think of them as like a cardboard box. So, for example, if I were to say to you, Sprite, the lemonade, right? Open up your Sprite box, for example, and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. What are the main colours of Sprite, for example? On in italics, not in italics, but does the writing go diagonally up or diagonally down on a can, for example? What are the flavours of Sprite, right? What's the font colour? Now, the point I'm trying to make here is mainly because I've got a Sprite can right here, but if you open up that box, you have all this information about your knowledge of, say, Sprite. Some of that information may be wrong, right? So, for example, it goes up, basically, right? It's green and yellow, obviously. It's lemon lime Sprite. Don't know why I always thought it was lemonade, but it's lemon lime. Writing's obviously in white. But the point is, sometimes your schemas are wrong. So you have schemas for 4 things, basically, and they are on here. Now, I just want to make quite an important note here. This isn't in your workbook because you're very, very unlikely actually going to get asked questions on this. However, you definitely can use this in other parts of the spec. So, for example, depression, you can use this for, and to be honest, it really helps your understanding of schemas. So there's 4 types of schemas. You got objects, for example, what a tree looks like. So you have an object for a teddy bear, for example. I know that is truly quite traumatizing. You have a schema for yourself. I may explain that teddy later on, by the way. You have a schema for yourself, and again, that comes in for depression. So are you a motivated person? Are you a confident person? Are you a happy person? You have a schema of yourself. That may be right, that may be wrong. By the way, that is pretty much what depression is when this schema goes toxic. You have a schema about roles, and we would have looked at this, or we will look at this for Zimbardo, how people are supposed to behave in certain situations. Now, again, that schema can be wrong. As a student, you are supposed to turn up on time. You are supposed to hand in your work, but not all of you do that. Maybe because you think that that's not a role, I don't know. And then you have a schema of events as well. Knowing what type of greeting you should do in a certain culture is a good example of this. Now, again, you can be right, you can be wrong. So what I also want to go through here is an example of a schema, and then go through the changes of a schema. Now, again, you're not going to get asked questions on this, so you don't need to know this for an exam question, but it's really going to help your understanding of a schema, because I think that's something that students tend to struggle with quite a bit. So schemas are made from our past experience, basically, right? Our previous experience, our childhood experiences. We understand the world through our experiences a lot of the time. So an example of your schemas is your ability to tell cats and dogs apart. Now, hopefully all of you can do this, but you never used to be able to do it, right? You were either introduced to cats first or dogs first, possibly both, although maybe not. So both have fur, both have got whiskers, both got 4 legs and a tail, but you've adapted your schemas over the years to be able to identify differences between them and thus know when a creature comes up to you that you've never seen before. Schemas, and here's a very important point about schemas that's definitely worth writing down. Schemas act as a shortcut for us to understand the world when we're in situations that we're not used to. So I do have an example just here. So imagine you go to the zoo as a child, right? First time you've ever been to the zoo. Let's say it's Marwell. You're likely going to see animals that you've never seen before, and therefore you have no schema for them. You may have a schema for similar animals, but not for, I don't know, screaming monkeys, for example. Maybe that's the first time you've ever heard anyone mention about screaming monkeys. I remember that from Marwell. They're monkeys, right? That really scream. Like, they're horrible little shits. So we're going to go through these 4 stages about how you reconstruct a schema, right? So first stage is assimilation. Okay, you see a tiger at the zoo for the first time. You've never seen a tiger before. Some weird childhood. Yeah, you never saw, I don't know, Jungle Book or something. It's Jungle Book for tigers. Blue's a bear, isn't he? I'm sure there's a tiger in there. Anyway, you spot the fur, you spot the whiskers, you spot the tail, and you think, oh, mummy, look at that dog, right? You've matched it perfectly to your understanding of what a dog is, but yet you've got it wrong. So assimilation, and again, this is another good phrase to note down. Assimilation is when you, in a novel situation, you take stimuli and you try fit it into an existing schema. I'll say that again. You can easily rewind it if you didn't get that. But in a novel situation, in a new and unfamiliar situation, we try to assimilate new stimuli into our existing schemas. So, for example, if I were to show you this again, this is probably a new thing you've never seen before. Probably. You may take this and try to assimilate it into your schemas, right? Teddy? What is it kind of thing? I would count this as a teddy kind of thing. But the point is, you've never seen this before. This really is quite creepy, actually. It's horrible to stare at yourself. But you're going to try assimilate that into existing schemas. Now, sometimes it doesn't work, right? So your mum calmly kneels down and explains that you're actually an idiot and that's a tiger, right? Tiger, you weirdo. That's not a dog, right? Now, you are stunned. You're amazed by this, right? And what we enter, something called disequilibrium. Right, equilibrium means balance. Disequilibrium means imbalance, obviously. And the reason why we enter it like a state of imbalance is because, oh my good Lord, there's something in our environment that does not match our schemas, and that makes us feel uncomfortable, and something's got to be done. So essentially, you have 2 options. You can either change your existing schema or create an entirely new schema. Now, why in this case, right? You've thought a tiger's a dog because you're a stupid idiot. Right, fine. We don't need to change a current schema because we're not updating any information about dogs. Instead, what we need to do is we need to create an entirely new schema and label this one tiger. And that's what you would do in this case. So accommodation is the 3rd stage. Clearly, the schema of dog does not need updating. Instead, you need to create a new schema for tiger, putting everything about its stripes, for example, how big they are, their tails, the fact one appears in Jungle Book, for example. That might be a wrong schema, actually. I don't know if there is. Anyway, and with accommodation, you will always look to alter a current schema if necessary or create a new one before eventually we enter equilibrium. All of a sudden, the world is back in balance again. Everything in our surroundings can be explained by our current schemas. So I'm just going to reiterate, you're not going to get asked a question about any of these 4. However, I do still want you to write it down because it's so useful for helping us understand our schemas. So cognitive approach, let's go back to that in general, right? Yes, the computational model is quite important. Yes, schemas are also quite important. But you need to be able to explain how the cognitive approach is focused about studying internal processes, right? But that's like biological approach, not quite. These are more processes that we cannot see. We can see biological approaches, we can see biological processes, right? That's easy, that's fine. But what we can't do is sorry, it's quite warm. But what we can't, that breeze is lovely. We can't see attention, we can't see memory, and the cognitive approach is focused quite heavily on that. So the other key term here, it's really hot, but I'm drinking tea because that makes sense, is inference. Inference is basically making an educated guess about phenomena based on results. Right. So it's sorry, I'll rephrase that slightly. It's making an educated guess on phenomena we cannot see based on results. So an inference is basically an educated guess about something we can't see. You do kind of need to know about cognitive neuroscience, and I've got a little bit here as well. So again, quite important. The cognitive approach has teamed up with the biological approach, and you do need to know this for several reasons, actually. But the cognitive approach has a cognitive and biological approach has teamed up to create the cognitive neuroscience field. This is a new field, like 10, 15 years old. It's basically an attempt to try and map your thoughts so that we can actually potentially mind read in the future, which is amazing, really. And we're trying to map how we think. What you need to know in particular are the practical applications of this field. So, for example, here are a couple here. I'm not going to go through them in too much detail, but you do need to know a couple of these practical applications, how in the next 5 to 10 years cognitive neuroscience is going to help us. One way that always stays with me is that bottom one, giving individuals with paralysis the ability to move through thinking. Now, we all do this unless you are paralyzed, but we have now been able to attach, I say we, again, I've done very little, but we've attached robots or like machinery onto people's hand, connected it into their brain, and when they think, the robot moves basically, and like is able to kind of claw your hands together, etc., etc. Cognitive neuroscience is having a huge effect on this, so you do kind of need to know it. Now, evaluations. Again, I'm going to go through this quite quickly because I'm a bit wary of time. I'm going to pick what I think are the best ones here because not all of these are fantastic. So, cognitive approach sits in the middle of all the approaches. It's not reductionist or holistic. It's not free will or it's not deterministic. It doesn't. It's not nature. It's not nurture. It sits on the fence, which means it's able to be combined with a lot of approaches quite well. So how I would phrase this, by the way, is it has good adaptability. It has good versatility in being able to be used with or in conjunction with other approaches. So, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy is a mixture of behaviorism, which is in the video, and cognitive approach as well. What I would also argue is most research into the cognitive approach tends to use laboratory experiments which lack ecological validity. So a lot of the findings you find with cognitive approach may not be able to be applied. Doesn't take into account genetic factors. It is not reductionist, though. Do not say, apart from mechanical reductionism, do not say that the cognitive approach is reductionist. Unless it's mechanical reductionism, right? And that's why I've put in italics to an extent. What we mean by mechanical reductionism, and again, it's a really, really good term to know, it's reducing complex behavior down to that behavior being merely explained by a model of some kind, multi-store model, computational model, working memory model, so on and so forth. So there is a model answer here. See what I did there? That's quite nice. Layered. That's pretty clever. There is a model answer here. It's a comparison one. I'll let you read through it. The only thing I would point out here is that comparison 1 and comparison 2, it's not kind of evidence and elaboration. You're evidencing both sides of what you are comparing. So a criticism of the cognitive approach is that it lacks the empirical and scientific rigor that the biological approach holds, right? So it's saying that biological is more scientific, more observable. On the one hand, the biological approach can be praised for largely being able to observe a lot of the biological phenomena, for example, dopamine causing schizophrenia, whereas the cognitive approach, many of the proposed causes of behavior cannot be observed. For example, it is not physically possible to observe someone's thinking pattern yet. Therefore, the approach is not empirical. It's a good term to use, actually, empirical. Empirical means to be able to physically observe something. The cognitive approach is not empirical, therefore it's not scientific. That is pretty much a quick run through. I did very, very briefly just want to go through the workbook to see if there were any other things that we have not gone through. There's quite a lot here, to be honest. Cognitive primacy, but again, that's in the workbook, so I don't need to go through that. Linear systematic way, for example. So the way that we go for systematic means we all go through it in the same order, like input, process, output, so on and so forth. Too cold now. What else have I? An inference, that's in the workbook, so you should be able to say that. Input, process, output. Yes, fine. This is actually quite a good thing to be able to talk about here. Kind of how your schema of parties change, for example. So party to you, you've updated that schema quite a lot through your past experience, turning 14, turning 15, turning 16. Your schemas about what a party is will change with time. Imagine if it doesn't. Imagine if for your 18th birthday you turn up and you were literally having a 5-year-old's birthday party, right? That would be quite concerning. So your schemas can change as your past experiences change as well. And then, I'm not going to go through that too much. Evidence to support the role of cognitive factors in behavior, I would look at depression. So there are a couple of things in the resource sheets, but there's also quite a lot in the depression part of psychopathology. You can use any piece of research. Beck, Ellis, for example, start looking at those. That will be quite good. The cognitive approach has led to significant practical applications. CBT, for example, CBT, or any kind of thinking therapy, or basically, by the way, the whole field of coaching is generally based on a lot of how we think to an extent. And cognitive reductionism, Jesus Christ, I can't believe this. Right, but that is pretty much it, right? That is pretty much it. So cognitive approach is quite complicated. It's more difficult to evaluate because it doesn't take extremist stances. It doesn't say it's nature, it doesn't say it's nurture, it doesn't say it's free will, it doesn't say it's determinism. So pay attention to these evaluations because cognitive approach is probably one of the hardest ones to evaluate. Hope that was useful. Bye.